You're listening to Big World Network.
Just Kill Me, Episode 1, My Awakening, written by Wendy Herman, read by Wendy Herman. If I've learned anything from my life thus far, it is this. No matter how much you plan, you can't prepare yourself for everything. I was a planner. No, I was a control freak, bordering on obsessive-compulsive disorder. My life was perfectly ordered and perfectly unfulfilling. I can trace the unraveling of my immaculately knitted existence to one day and one specific and potentially devastating event. The day was a repeat, a regurgitation of the previous 5,000 or so days since I had had my first child almost 15 years before, until it wasn't. I sat at the computer, which was located on a small built-in desk, just off my spacious gourmet kitchen, with my back to the rest of the house. My oldest son Levi and his younger brother Blaze were in the family room attempting to assassinate each other in the latest As Real As It Gets video game on our 62-inch HD plasma screen. I was focusing on my task at hand, but also keeping my ears perked for any inappropriate language. I knew it would only be a matter of time before I would have to abruptly stop what I was doing to break up the latest physical altercation between the two boys. My youngest, Rowan, who was just 3.5 years old, sauntered into the kitchen just then and strode to my side. He held up a quarter, and my ears heard him say, "Mommy, I'm pretending this is gum." But my brain only half registered the meaning. I murmured, "No, sweetie, that's a quarter," having no clue what my complacence would give birth to in the next few moments. As he walked away, I again focused on the gorgeous pair of knee-high black leather boots I was purchasing online, cursing my giant Yeti feet and praying I wouldn't have to return them. Then it all happened so fast, yet in painfully slow motion, that I had no idea how much real time actually clicked away on the clock. First, I heard a word float from the family room that wouldn't be allowed out of a 10-year-old's mouth in any universe, and, sighing, rose to head off the 14-year-old's inevitable response. As I turned, not wanting to disengage my eyes from those awesome boots, I noticed Rowan returning, but this time with both hands clutched around his throat. His lips were already turning blue. To say I panicked would be an understatement. I think I screamed, because the other two were in the room in a microsecond, running to me with frightened looks on their faces. When he realized Rowan was choking, Blaze immediately began to sob hysterically, yet froze in place. I had enough presence to know that my brain was not accessing any emergency training I may have had in my past, unlike so many people on the news who claimed it all came back to them in a flash when it was needed, even years after their training. All I could think to do was walk to the kitchen door that led outside and quickly slip on my bedazzled flip-flops. As I turned back around, I grabbed my Odyssey keys from the hook where they lived on the wall next to the door. I opened my mouth to say something, I have no idea what, to the other two boys. That's when I witnessed a miracle, right there in my kitchen. Levi calmly walked up behind Rowan and, almost casually, administered the Heimlich maneuver as if he was Dr. Heimlich himself. Immediately, Rowan coughed and out popped the diabolical quarter, along with about a tablespoon of bright red blood. So the whole thing took about 20 seconds. Then it was over. Rowan was fine. No thanks to me, but fine he was. I should have taken a deep breath of relief and gotten on with my day. I mean, there were dishes to be done, supper to be started, laundry to be sorted. Life goes on, right? So very wrong. Grateful as I was that Rowan was okay, and amazed beyond belief at the quick action of my oldest son, I suddenly felt like a completely different person. In an instant, I went from grounded soccer mom to detached soul suspended somewhere between the earth and heaven. I guess I was in psychological purgatory. Dishes? Who gave a rat's ass about dirty dishes when, at any moment, my precious baby could choke on a quarter and leave this world? Leave me. Supper? The only thought of food I may have had was that I wouldn't be able to stomach anything for quite some time, maybe forever. Laundry? Why did we have so many goddamn clothes anyway? None of it mattered. Suddenly, as I looked around my state-of-the-art kitchen, it was all so meaningless. I stood there, unsure of what to do next. Levi was sitting at the kitchen table now, Rowan on his lap, looking up at his now hero for life with glossy eyes. I realized I was actually hugging Blaze and we were both crying. Thank God. At least I hadn't checked out completely, I thought. Mustering my courage and remembering my motherly duty, I gave Blaze a reassuring final squeeze and released him as he began to calm down. Then I went to Rowan. I squatted in front of the chair he and Levi were sitting in. He smiled and asked me why spaghetti sauce had come out with the quarter. I closed my eyes for a second and grinned. He was so wonderful. How could I have ever gone on without him? His voice was a little hoarse for the next few hours, but within minutes of the incident he was back playing, having been given the stern briefing that money was to never go in his mouth again. Life seemed to return to normal for the boys almost immediately, but not for me. Even my husband, Trevor, who had been given 4 versions of the choking before he had even set both feet in the door that evening, was just thrilled that it all turned out okay, commended Levi for his instinctual reaction, then asked what was for supper. I told myself to just give it some time. It was a traumatic event, and it was understandable that I would feel out of sorts for a while. But it didn't get better. In fact, it seemed to get worse over the next few days. The feeling that I had been living in a naive fog up until the quarter, that blasted quarter, had shocked me out of my hazy world. That world where the most important thing was a pair of stupid black leather boots. Boots that had never been ordered. Boots that would forever remind me of the less than half a minute when I almost lost my son. In this new sharp world I now lived, every emotion was like an overwhelming wave that made me dizzy and blurred my vision. I was functioning, but I was different. Only my closest friend noticed. It had been 6 days since the evil quarter had almost taken my son, and Trevor and I were in the car headed for our favorite restaurant. We were meeting our oldest and dearest friend, Tyler Ripley, and his latest version of Miss Right Now, for our standard weekly catch-up session. Rip, as we had always called him, was an FBI agent, so naturally his stories since our last get-together would be much more riveting than our humdrum family life, though he couldn't even tell us the real exciting parts because they were classified. I had no intention of mentioning the quarter, as I was harboring a lot of shame for my lack of action, an apparent instinctual void, and I had told my husband as much. He was fine with it, especially since he had completely forgotten about it until I asked him in the car not to bring it up. We arrived at the restaurant, and Rip and his companion were there, an already opened bottle of wine next to the table. As we approached them, Rip stood to shake Trevor's hand. These 2 men were not the hugging type, even after 20 years of close friendship, and gave me the usual enthusiastic bear hug. He introduced us to his current sex partner, Elisa, and it didn't take us long to realize her English was minimal and entirely insufficient to carry on any kind of conversation. Of course, Rip translated for her every so often, as he was fluent in several languages, her native Russian being one of them, but eventually she became a fourth wheel and found companionship in her glass of wine, which she refilled several times throughout the evening. Any other night I would have felt sorry for her and made a concerted effort to include her in this close-knit circle of friends, but I was on a mission tonight, and it didn't involve charity work. I had hoped this night would restore my once simple, happy outlook. After all, it was a staple of my old life. This weekly event represented the wooden posts, buried deep in the ground, of the ever-growing fence of my well-ordered and predictable existence. Slat after identical slat. Sitting there listening to Rip talk about his latest case, using Jane Doe and other generic terms so as not to violate any FBI regulations, was the key. I was determined to go back into the Matrix. This new reality was too raw and frankly very distracting. For example, I had forgotten to put on the new earrings that I'd bought to go with the specific outfit I was wearing, and didn't notice until I checked my face in the entryway mirror of the restaurant. How could I have forgotten? I never forget to accessorize. Never. As I sat there with exaggerated interest in my eyes at every word that left Rip's mouth, he suddenly stopped talking and stared at me for a moment. I glanced at Trevor, then at Elisa, who was managing enough English to order another bottle of wine from the incredibly attentive waiter. But Rip continued to stare into my soul. "What?" I finally asked innocently. "What's wrong with you, Freya?" he accused. How the hell did he do that? "Nothing," I responded, afraid that if I said more I would explode, and all these new piercing emotions would shoot out of me, killing everyone in the restaurant, or worse, making me sound like a crazy person. "Okay," he said, not buying it for a minute. "Are you pregnant?" "What?" I exclaimed. "Pregnant? Really? What are we now, best girlfriends?" He cocked his head and continued to read my eyes, which I was sure were revealing everything. "What's going on? Something is different about you." We were all silent for a moment when Trevor, apparently forgetting my instruction in the car earlier, piped in. "Well, we did almost go from zone defense to man-on-man a few days ago." "Really? What happened?" Rip had immediately gotten the joke, as he had strongly advised us against having a third child years before by using the same analogy. Apparently the 2 kids we already had were severely hindering his social life. I decided to try to feign indifference. "It was nothing. Rowan was choking on a quarter and Levi did the Heimlich and saved him." My voice cracked on the word saved. So much for indifference. Rip's eyes grew wide. He was a self-proclaimed eternal bachelor, but as much as he joked about our kids being a burden, he wouldn't hesitate to jump into a raging river or an active volcano to save each one of them. He was better than an uncle. He was a fierce protector, an FBI-trained one at that. "Okay, that is definitely not nothing. Tell me what happened. Why the hell did he put a quarter in his mouth? He's never done that before, has he?" So I began to tell the story, and try as I might, I could not keep my obvious disdain toward my own reaction to the choking from showing. A lot. I had known Rip too long, and he knew me almost as well as my husband did. Or maybe better. When I finished, all was quiet for a moment. Then Rip said, "You know, no one can control how they will react in a situation like that. You need to stop beating yourself up about it, Freya. Everything turned out fine, and in the grand scheme of things, that's what's important, right?" "I keep telling her that," Trevor said, then gulped down the rest of his wine. He most certainly had not been telling me that, but I didn't say anything. I barely managed to give him a microscopic glare that I knew he could sense when Rip demanded my attention again. "So what's the deal, then?" he asked. What do you mean?" I inquired. I had told him everything, hadn't I? "I get that Rowan almost died," Rip began, to which Trevor responded by snorting into his wine glass. We both shot a quick laser beam through his head before we returned our attentions to each other. "And you feel your initial response was inadequate, right?" he asked. "It was inadequate. If Levi hadn't been there, Rowan would have—" I started, but he cut me off. "But Levi was there. And if you hadn't insisted he take that Red Cross babysitter's course last summer, he would have been just as useless as you were." I gave him a look of disapproval at his choice of words, and he shrugged an apology. But he was right. I had been useless, and I knew it. Suddenly I couldn't maintain the mental brick wall I'd been building since the incident, and my heart raced, my breath quickened, and, worst of all, my eyes started to water. Trevor decided this was a good time to engage in the conversation, and actually showed some compassion, after spending the past 6 days making me feel like I was drastically overreacting to the whole thing. As he put his arm around me, the tears started to flow, and I was powerless to stop it. Rip stood up and came around to sit on my other side, also putting an arm around me. My 2 favorite men, adult men anyway, were giving me their undivided attention at the same time, and I couldn't even allow myself to bask in it. I was in such a selfish place. All I could think of was how that damn quarter had ruined everything. I didn't blame Rowan. That wasn't it at all. I had always loved my children unconditionally, but now, the love hurt. What the hell was wrong with me? Fortunately, the restaurant was nearly empty, so my little breakdown hadn't garnered much outside attention. The waiter brought me a clean napkin to wipe my eyes, and I smiled at him reassuringly. That was about the time we all noticed Elisa had moved to a small corner table where two young businessmen were dining, and they seemed to be enjoying her rather inebriated company. She was a looker, but how they were communicating I had no idea. Then I watched her move to sit on one of the men's laps, and the two men laughed. I guess it had been a while since I had communicated with my body parts. I really needed to get out more. Rip proved his undying friendship by barely noticing Elisa's defection, and took the napkin from me after I wiped my tears. He was a good friend. Trevor wrapped both his arms around me and gave me a squeeze. I don't know why you've been stressing about this so much. You're a great mother. I know he was trying to help, but it just made me feel worse. If that was even possible. Yes, apparently it was, I realized. I looked into his eyes and smiled as convincingly as I could. Not concerning myself with whether or not he bought my false happiness, I wiggled out of his embrace and stood. I'm fine, really. I just needed to release all that, I guess. I'm going to the restroom to check my face. Be right back, okay? Both men nodded, but Rip watched me until I turned the corner, while my husband finished his steak. Rip was on to me, I was sure of it, although I didn't even know what there was to be onto yet. Standing in the restroom, I stared at myself in the mirror. My waterproof mascara had proved worth the money, but my eyes were still rather puffy. I wasn't sure what to do, so I stood there, trying to read the reflection of my own eyes, demanding they tell me what was going on. Why was this happening to me? Was I having a nervous breakdown? If so, why? I was a very stable person normally. Well, I was. Wasn't I? Just then an older woman entered the restroom and snapped me out of my self-interrogation. I leaned down and turned on the sink, pretending I had been doing what one usually goes to the restroom to do. I washed my hands, soap and everything. The woman quickly used the facilities, although I heard no telltale sounds, and re-emerged, claiming the sink next to mine. She caught my puffy eyes in the mirror and smiled sadly. "Having a bit of a rough patch?" she asked, genuine concern in her inquiry. "Just life, I guess. Normal family drama, you know." Where had I pulled that lame response out of? Well, we were in the bathroom, so I guess it was appropriate that I was now talking out of my ass. "Those two good-looking men out there sure seem to adore you, so it can't be too bad," she observed. "They are great," I replied. Why in the hell was I still standing there talking to a complete stranger? I told myself to dry my hands, smile at the nice, although a bit nosy, woman and leave. I retrieved a scratchy brown towel from the dispenser on the wall and began drying my hands, but my feet wouldn't move. Something was keeping me there, goading me to confide in this sweet old lady. She was taking her time washing her hands. She wanted to talk too. I could feel it. I have 3 kids, all boys, lots of drama. Always someone sick or getting hurt. I trailed off, not sure how to keep this odd encounter going, but I desperately wanted to. "Did one of your boys get hurt?" she asked, picking up where I had left off. She was good. "Oh, no, not really," I responded. "My little one had a slight choking incident earlier this week, but he's just fine." "Young children are always putting things in their mouths, aren't they?" she mused. "Why, my son used to fill his mouth with small rocks, scared me to death every time. But he kept doing it, and he never choked, praise God. He grew out of it pretty quick. Yours will, too." I felt the need to elaborate. "Actually, he's never done anything like this before. None of my boys have. It was the first time, and I chickened out right there. I couldn't do it. I couldn't tell someone I had just met in a public restroom that I felt as if my old life was right in front of me, in the mirror, but I couldn't touch it, not really. And I could never, ever go back to it. It was like I was feeling, really feeling, for the first time, and I didn't think I liked it. That was when she finished drying her hands. I hadn't remembered her turning off the water, but it was off, and turned to me. "Invigorating, wasn't it?" she asked. What? Had she been listening to anything I said? "You thought he was going to die right there in front of you, but he didn't. You'd never felt more alive, and now you can't get rid of that feeling." She was inches from my face now, her eyes intense as she spoke, as if it was imperative I didn't miss a word. "What feeling?" I whispered, wondering what Pandora's box I had just opened, and my apprehension steadily on its way to outright fear. She gave a quick sigh and smiled at me. "That you can finally start living."
You're listening to Big World Network.